Hey everyone, tonight we're stepping into the gaslit streets of Victorian England, where fog rolls thick as secrets and every corner hides a story darker than the soot-stained buildings. This is a world where crime wasn't just a fact of life, it was an obsession, a spectacle, and sometimes a twisted form of entertainment. Before we begin, take a moment to like this video and subscribe if you enjoy deep dives into history's shadows. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from and whether you'd have survived as a detective in the 1800s. Now, get comfortable, maybe dim those lights, and let's wander together through the most dangerous era in London's history. The year is 1842, and you're standing on a cobblestone street in Whitechapel. The air tastes like coal smoke and yesterday's fish. Around you, the city pulses with a million souls packed into spaces that should hold half that number. Horse hooves clatter, street vendors shout, and somewhere in the distance, a constable's whistle pierces the evening air. This is Victorian England, and crime is everywhere. Pickpockets work the crowds with fingers faster than thought. Forgers ply their trade in basement workshops. Murderers walk the same streets you do, and nobody knows their faces until it's far too late. Let me take you back to 1829, when Sir Robert Peel created the Metropolitan Police Force. Before this moment, London's crime prevention consisted of night watchmen, who were often older than the buildings they guarded, and just as creaky. The new police wore blue coats and tall hats, and Londoners called them peelers or bobbies, with a mix of mockery and hope. The early police were not detectives. They walked beats, broke up fights, and arrested drunks. Detection was considered ungentlemanly, too much like spying, too much like being a paid informant, which was barely better than being a criminal yourself. But crime didn't care about respectability. And soon the force needed people who could actually solve cases. In 1842, 8 men formed the detective department at Scotland Yard. 8 men for the entire metropolis. Their successes were real but incomplete. Their failures instructive but frustrating. The detective emerged as Victorian England's answer to chaos, a figure who could impose order through observation, science, and logic. Sherlock Holmes wasn't just entertainment, he was wish fulfillment for a society desperate to believe that reason could conquer randomness. Real detectives did their best with limited tools, working cases that newspapers scrutinized daily and the public judged constantly. Some were brilliant, some were lucky. Most were simply persistent, grinding through investigations with notebook and boot leather until patterns emerged from chaos. The amateur detective phenomenon revealed Victorian society's deepest anxieties. Crime wasn't just something professionals handled. It was everyone's business, everyone's entertainment, everyone's obsession. Drawing rooms became courtrooms where families tried fictional cases and debated real ones. Crime clubs formed universities. Newspapers printed diagrams of murder scenes. The nation collectively played detective, convinced that they could solve what baffled professionals. This obsession served purposes beyond entertainment. It let people engage with violence from safe distances. It provided intellectual puzzles in an age increasingly dominated by routine industrial labor. It offered a sense of participation in public life for people, especially women, excluded from politics. And it reinforced social messages about morality, class, and proper behavior. Each crime became a story about Victorian values, even when those crimes exposed Victorian hypocrisy. The science of detection evolved throughout the era, though less quickly than the public expected. Fingerprinting arrived late after decades of resistance. Photography helped, but couldn't solve crimes alone. Forensic medicine advanced while remaining imperfect and disputed. Toxicology improved, but interpretations varied wildly. The telegraph caught fleeing criminals. The microscope revealed hidden evidence. But mostly, detection remained about people. Witnesses, informants, confessions, and the detective's ability to piece together fragmentary information into coherent narratives. Famous cases became national obsessions because they revealed uncomfortable truths.
The Road Hill House murder showed that respectability was no defense against violent impulses. Jack the Ripper exposed the horrific conditions of East End poverty that polite society preferred to ignore. The Cleveland Street scandal revealed that wealthy predators could escape justice that crushed poor offenders. Each scandal pulled back curtains Victorians preferred closed, forcing them to confront realities their ideologies denied. The criminal justice system evolved from brutal and chaotic to slightly less brutal and somewhat more organized. Public hangings ended not from humanitarian concern alone, but because they created disorder rather than preventing it. Prisons shifted from places of pure punishment to institutions theoretically focused on reform, though practice never matched theory. Police became more professional, more systematic, and occasionally more honest. Courts developed better evidence rules and fairer procedures. Progress happened, grudgingly, pushed by reformers who insisted that justice required more than maintaining order. But the system remained fundamentally unjust, in ways Victorians couldn't or wouldn't fix. Class determined outcomes as much as evidence. The poor received harsh justice for survival crimes, while the wealthy escaped serious consequences for exploitation and violence. Women faced double standards, judged not just for crimes, but for violating gender expectations. Children were imprisoned for offenses born of desperation. And the system's main success, creating professional institutions for managing crime, came at the cost of acknowledging that poverty and inequality fueled crime more than individual moral failure. The criminal underworld existed as the system's shadow side, a community of people surviving through theft, fraud, violence, and vice because legitimate options failed them. These weren't the masterminds of detective fiction or the romantic rogues and penny dreadfuls. They were desperate people making desperate choices. Children trained to steal before they could read, women selling their bodies to avoid starvation, men burgling houses because honest labor paid starvation wages.
This underworld had its own structures, codes, and hierarchies. Master criminals lived respectably, operating criminal enterprises like businesses. Journeyman thieves plied specialized trades learned through apprenticeship. Petty criminals scrambled for survival at the bottom. Flash houses served as criminal headquarters. Rookeries provided sanctuary from police. And informant networks let police and criminals collaborate in maintaining an equilibrium that benefited both more than it benefited justice. The relationship between criminal and respectable worlds was more complex than Victorians admitted. Movement between them occurred constantly. The honest poor might turn to crime when circumstances demanded. Successful criminals might buy their way into respectability. Police and criminals maintained relationships essential to both. Police needed informants, criminals needed warnings about raids. Corruption wasn't aberration, but system logic, a necessary accommodation between incompatible objectives. Walking through Victorian crime reveals continuities that should disturb us. Our police forces descend from Peel's bobbies. Our detective procedures grew from Victorian investigation methods. Our prisons inherited Victorian assumptions about punishment and reform. Our celebrity criminals and crime obsessions echo Victorian sensations. Our class-based justice mirrors theirs, just with better disguises. The systems we inherited carry Victorian DNA, with all its promise and prejudice. But walking through Victorian crime also reveals how far we've advanced. We have forensic science that actually works. We have due process protections Victorians lacked. We recognize poverty as structural rather than moral failure, officially anyway. We've ended public executions, transportation, and child imprisonment from minor offenses. We've acknowledged that justice requires more than efficient punishment. Progress happened, though never as much or as fast as reformers wanted. The Victorians taught us valuable lessons through their mistakes. They showed that you can't eliminate crime through harsh punishment alone. They demonstrated that investigation requires systematic methods, not just intuition. They proved that public pressure can drive reform, but also create injustice when it demands quick convictions over accurate ones.
They revealed that crime reflects society's structures more than individual moral failures. And they showed that justice systems can improve when people insist they must. Their greatest legacy might be the detective, both a professional investigator and the amateur enthusiast. Victorians made detection respectable, transforming it from suspicious spying into honorable profession and engaging hobby. They created the crime story as a literary genre and cultural obsession. They established that solving crimes required observation, logic, and science, not just force and authority. Sherlock Holmes remains Victorian England's gift to world culture, an archetype of rational investigation that persists 130 years after his creation. But their cautionary legacy matters too. They showed how justice systems can be corrupted by class interests, how punishment can become entertainment, how public fascination with crime can overshadow concern for victims and prevention. They demonstrated that efficiency and fairness often conflict, that professionalization can become bureaucracy, and that scientific methods can be misused as easily as gut instinct. As you emerge from this walk through Victorian crime, you're changed by what you've seen. You understand now that the cozy mystery, the brilliant detective, the bumbling police, and the cunning criminal are fictions built on historical foundations. Real Victorian detection was harder, messier, and less certain than fiction suggests. Real Victorian criminals were usually desperate rather than clever. Real Victorian justice was uneven at best, absent entirely for many. You've seen poverty that drove crime, investigated without DNA or computers, prison as punishment rather than rehabilitation, hangings as public spectacles, and children trained as thieves from ages they should have been learning to read. You've met detectives who cared deeply about justice, and others who cared mainly about clearance rates. You've encountered criminals who were monsters, and others who were simply unlucky. You've watched a society grappling with crime while refusing to address its causes. And you've learned that crime isn't simple. It's not good people versus bad people. It's people in impossible situations making terrible choices. Systems that claim to deliver justice, but often just maintain order. And societies that would rather punish than prevent. The Victorian era crystallized these tensions in ways that remain relevant because we haven't fully resolved them. The fog closes around you now, thick and final. The last gaslight gutters. The city sleeps, if such a city ever truly sleeps. Somewhere a constable walks his beat, checking shop doors and watching shadows. Somewhere a detective pores over case files looking for patterns others missed. Somewhere a criminal plans tomorrow's work. Somewhere a prisoner marks another day on a cell wall. And somewhere a family reads about the latest sensation in the evening paper, turning tragedy into entertainment over tea. You're walking away from Victorian London now, but you carry it with you. Every crime story you consume, every detective show you watch, every true crime podcast you follow, they're all descendants of Victorian obsessions. Every time police investigate crimes, they use methods Victorians pioneered. Every time we debate criminal justice reform, we echo Victorian arguments. Every time we're simultaneously horrified by crime and fascinated by it, we're being perfectly Victorian. The streets empty before you. The sounds fade. No more horse hooves, no more vendor cries, no more constables' whistles. Just the soft pad of your own footsteps and the whisper of history settling into memory. You survived your journey through Victorian crime, learned its lessons, and emerged intact, if a bit unsettled. Rest now. Let the images fade. The gaslit streets, the foggy alleys, the courtrooms and prisons, the crime scenes in detective offices. Let the characters blur, the desperate criminals, the dedicated detectives, the corrupt police, the unjust judges, the suffering victims. They've served their purpose, teaching you about a world that seems distant, but echoes constantly in our own. The Victorian era ended over a century ago, but their ghosts remain. Not the supernatural kind that Victorian spiritualists claim to contact, but the institutional and cultural ghosts that haunt our modern world. Our assumptions about crime, our approaches to justice, our fascination with detection, these are Victorian inheritances, modified by time, but recognizably descended from what you've witnessed tonight.
As you drift towards sleep, remember the ordinary people whose lives intersected with crime. Not the famous detectives or notorious criminals, but the victims who never got justice, the witnesses who were never believed, the prisoners who were never reformed, the children who never escaped the system, and the reformers who kept pushing for better despite constant resistance. Remember, too, that history isn't destiny. The Victorians inherited brutal systems and made them slightly better. We inherited their systems and can improve them further. Progress isn't inevitable, but it's possible when people insist on it, work for it, and refuse to accept that current injustices are natural or unchangeable. The dark streets of Victorian England taught us that crime reflects society's failures more than individual evil, that justice requires more than efficient punishment, that investigation benefits from science and skepticism, and that public fascination with crime can drive both reform and sensationalism. These lessons remain relevant as we navigate our own crime anxieties and justice debates. So rest easy now, knowing you've walked where Victorians walked, seen what they saw, and learned from their struggles. The fog has lifted, the lamps have dimmed, the city sleeps. And you, having survived a journey through Victorian crime and justice, can close your eyes and drift away. Grateful that you live in a time with DNA evidence, Miranda rights, and social safety nets, however imperfect they remain. Tomorrow you'll wake to your own era, with its own crimes and its own detectives, its own injustices and its own reformers. But tonight, you've been Victorian, walking streets where every shadow might hide a pickpocket, every fog might conceal a murderer, and every crime might become tomorrow's sensation. You've learned that the past isn't as distant as we imagine, that progress is possible but never complete, and that understanding history helps us navigate the present. Sleep well, modern detective. You've earned your rest. The Victorian streets are behind you now, preserved in memory and history books, teaching their lessons to anyone willing to listen. And in the morning, you'll carry those lessons forward into a world still grappling with crime, still seeking justice, and still, occasionally, thrilling to a good mystery, just like the Victorians did all those years ago. The case is closed, the investigation complete, the story told, and you, dear listener, have been the best companion a guide could ask for through the dark and dangerous streets of Victorian England. Until next time, stay curious, stay skeptical, and remember that every crime story, fiction or fact, teaches us something about ourselves and the societies we build. Good night.
The answer, apparently, was that the public trusted results more than methods. A solved case could forgive almost any tactic, while an unsolved mystery made headlines and ended careers. Detectives felt this pressure intensely. They worked cases that journalists covered daily, that cartoonists satirized in weekly papers, that the public discussed in endless detail. Failure wasn't private, it was a spectacle. Consider the case of Detective Sergeant William Thick, who spent years hunting Leather Apron, a nickname for a suspect in the Jack the Ripper murders. Thick was certain he had his man, until he didn't. The press mocked him mercilessly, but Thick kept working, kept investigating, because that's what Victorian detectives did. They accepted that some cases would never close, that some criminals would never hang, and that the dark corners of London would always harbor secrets. The detective department grew slowly. By 1878, it had expanded to about 40 men, still woefully inadequate for a city of millions. They handled everything from blackmail to murder, from fraud to arson.
Their success rate was impressive, given their resources. About 80% of property crimes were solved, though violent crimes proved harder to crack. Why the difference? Property crimes left trails. Stolen goods had to be fenced, and fences could be pressured to inform. Thieves often worked in groups, and groups could be infiltrated or turned against each other. But murders, especially those without obvious motives or witnesses, were different beasts entirely. They required luck, persistence, and occasionally divine intervention. Detectives developed their own culture. They met at specific pubs where they'd trade information and theories. They had favorites among the criminal class, thieves who were reliable informants, forgers who'd authenticate documents for a price, receivers who'd tip off police about rival gangs. This shadow economy of information was how real detection worked, far removed from the logical deductions of Sherlock Holmes. They also developed superstitions. Some detectives wouldn't start a case on Friday. Others carried lucky coins or pieces of rope from famous hangings. They'd visit fortune tellers before important raids, consult mediums about cold cases, and occasionally attend seances where the dead supposedly revealed their murderers. Victorian rationality had limits, especially when facing the inexplicable. The public remained fascinated. Detective memoirs became bestsellers. Inspector Adolphus Dolly Williamson published his recollections to great acclaim, though he had to carefully edit out the seedier aspects of his work. The public wanted detectives who were heroes, not men who dealt daily with humanity's worst impulses and occasionally cut corners to get results. Amateur detectives continued to proliferate. The Sherlock Holmes stories inspired countless readers to try their hand at detection. Some would visit crime scenes and search for overlooked clues. Others would write to newspapers with elaborate theories about ongoing cases. A few would even approach Scotland Yard directly, offering their services as consultants. The police treated these amateurs with bemused patience. Occasionally, a civilian would notice something useful. More often, they'd contaminate evidence, spread false theories, or waste valuable time. But the public's enthusiasm couldn't be discouraged entirely. It was part of what made detection respectable in the first place. By the end of the Victorian era, the detective had transformed from a suspicious novelty to a cultural necessity. Cities couldn't function without them. Justice, or at least the appearance of justice, required their skills. And the public's appetite for crime stories ensured that detection would only grow more sophisticated, more scientific, and more central to how society understood itself. The Victorian drawing room became an unlikely headquarters for crime solving. While professional detectives prowled the streets, respectable citizens gathered around tea tables to dissect the latest murders, thefts, and scandals. They approached crime like a complicated equation that could be solved through logical deduction and proper breeding. They were almost always wrong, but that never diminished their enthusiasm. This wasn't merely casual interest. Victorian society had transformed crime into a spectator sport. When a particularly juicy murder occurred, newspapers would print updates twice daily. Street vendors sold illustrated broadsheets depicting the crime scene. Music halls incorporated the latest murders into their comedy routines. The whole nation became a jury of amateur detectives, each convinced they could solve what the professionals couldn't. The phenomenon started innocently enough. In the 1840s, newspapers began printing detailed crime reports to boost circulation. Readers couldn't get enough of the lurid details: where the body was found, what wounds it bore, which neighbors heard suspicious noises. The papers obliged with increasingly graphic descriptions, pushing the boundaries of Victorian propriety while claiming to serve the public interest. Middle-class women especially seized upon crime as an acceptable topic for discussion. In an era when politics, business, and most intellectual pursuits were deemed unsuitable for ladies, detection offered a respectable outlet for analytical thinking. Women's magazines published Mystery of the Month columns where readers could submit their solutions. Some of the most insightful crime analysis came from anonymous female correspondents who used their keen observation of human nature to pierce through official narratives. Crime clubs formed in universities, literary societies, and even churches. Members would meet monthly to discuss famous cases, debate detection methods, and sometimes visit crime scenes as educational outings. These weren't morbid gatherings, or at least participants didn't see them that way. They viewed themselves as engaged citizens, using reason to combat chaos, bringing order to a disordered world. The most famous amateur detective of the era never existed: Sherlock Holmes. Arthur Conan Doyle's creation arrived in 1887 and immediately captured the Victorian imagination. Holmes represented everything amateur sleuths aspired to be: observant, logical, unflappable, and always correct. He could deduce your entire life history from a button on your coat. He solved impossible crimes through pure reason. He made detection look like high art rather than grubby police work.
The public's response was extraordinary. Readers wrote to Holmes as if he were real, sending him cases to solve. They visited 221B Baker Street looking for his rooms. When Doyle killed Holmes in The Final Problem, the outcry forced him to resurrect the detective years later. People needed Holmes to exist because he represented their fantasy of what detection could be: clean, clever, and certain. Real detection was messier. Professional detectives resented amateur interference, but they couldn't stop it. When Major General Charles Gordon was murdered in Khartoum in 1885, hundreds of armchair detectives sent theories to Scotland Yard. When Florence Maybrick was convicted of poisoning her husband in 1889, her case became a cause célèbre, with amateur detectives fighting to prove her innocence or guilt for decades. The Maybrick case perfectly illustrated the amateur detective phenomenon. Florence, an American married to a Liverpool cotton merchant, allegedly poisoned him with arsenic. The evidence was circumstantial, but damning. She'd purchased flypapers, which contained arsenic, shortly before his death. She'd been having an affair. And, most suspicious of all, she remained remarkably calm during the investigation. Professional detectives saw an open and shut case. Amateur sleuths saw layers of intrigue. Some theorized that James Maybrick was a serial killer, perhaps even Jack the Ripper, and that Florence had killed in self-defense. Others believed she'd been framed by her husband's brothers, who stood to inherit his estate. Still others thought the whole thing was a tragic accident caused by James' own arsenic habit. These theories proliferated in newspapers, pamphlets, and eventually entire books. Amateur detectives formed committees to investigate. They traveled to Liverpool to interview witnesses. They hired chemists to analyze the medical evidence. They generated thousands of pages of analysis, very little of which was useful, but all of which sold newspapers. The phenomenon revealed something about Victorian society. Detection had become a way to participate in public life without actually changing anything. You could have strong opinions about crime without advocating for social reform. You could discuss violence without acknowledging the poverty and desperation that fueled it. You could play detective without confronting the reality that most criminals weren't masterminds, but desperate people making terrible choices. Yet amateur detection did occasionally produce results. In 1860, when young Francis Saville Kent was murdered at Road Hill House, public speculation eventually pushed the investigation forward. Professional detectives had initially focused on servants, assuming no family member could commit such a crime. Amateur sleuths, unburdened by social prejudice, immediately suspected the older sister. Years later, she confessed, validating the amateur theories. The tools of amateur detection were surprisingly sophisticated. Enthusiasts studied books on forensic medicine, learning to identify poisons and estimate time of death. They collected crime scene photographs and built elaborate filing systems. Some maintained correspondence with convicted criminals, believing they could gain insights into the criminal mind. Others specialized in particular types of crime: forgery, confidence schemes, or murder.
Technology enhanced amateur detection. The telegraph allowed armchair sleuths to gather information quickly. Photography meant crime scenes could be studied from the comfort of home. And the expanding railway network enabled the most dedicated amateurs to visit crime locations personally, much to the annoyance of local police. Crime museums became popular attractions. The Black Museum at Scotland Yard, officially the Crime Museum, housed artifacts from famous cases, murder weapons, death masks of executed criminals, ingenious tools used by burglars. Though not open to the public, connections could occasionally secure a private tour, and those who visited would dine out on the experience for months. The obsession extended to collecting. Victorian scrapbooks often contained newspaper clippings about crimes, execution broadsides, and authenticated letters from notorious criminals. Some collectors paid extraordinary sums for murder weapons or clothing worn by victims. This wasn't seen as ghoulish, but as preserving important historical artifacts. Public executions were another manifestation of the crime obsession. Until 1868, hangings occurred in public, drawing crowds of thousands. Families would arrive early to secure good views. Vendors sold food and drink. The condemned's last words were recorded and printed. It was entertainment and moral instruction combined, a spectacle that reminded everyone of justice's swift hand. After 1868, executions moved inside prison walls, but the public's appetite didn't diminish. Newspapers provided detailed descriptions of private hangings, including how long the condemned took to die and whether they maintained dignity at the end. Crowds still gathered outside prisons during execution hours, waiting for the black flag that signaled justice had been done. Amateur detective clubs developed elaborate rituals. Some would reenact famous crimes, with members playing different roles to understand what might have happened. Others created mock trials, where they'd present evidence and arguments before voting on guilt or innocence. These weren't mere games. Participants took them seriously, believing they were honing skills that made society safer. The phenomenon had class dimensions. Upper-class amateurs could access crime scenes, interview witnesses, and correspond with officials in ways working-class amateurs couldn't. But crime stories themselves were remarkably democratic. A murder was fascinating whether it occurred in a mansion or a tenement, and newspapers ensured everyone could follow along. Women faced particular constraints. While they could discuss crimes in drawing rooms or contribute anonymous analyses to magazines, actively investigating was considered unladylike. A few bold women defied this convention, visiting crime scenes in disguise or hiring private detectives to pursue cases that intrigued them. These women anticipated the female detectives who'd emerge in the early 20th century.
The amateur detective craze had real consequences. It put pressure on police to solve cases quickly, leading sometimes to hasty arrests and wrongful convictions. It created a market for sensationalism that rewarded newspapers for printing ever more lurid details. And it occasionally contaminated evidence as eager amateurs trampled through crime scenes looking for overlooked clues. But it also reflected genuine civic engagement. Victorians cared about justice, even if their understanding of it was filtered through class prejudice and social convention. They wanted to believe that reason could triumph over chaos, that evil could be identified and punished, that the world made sense. Detection offered that reassurance, whether performed by professionals or enthusiastic amateurs. By century's end, the amateur detective had become a fixture of British culture. Sherlock Holmes had inspired imitators in dozens of novels. Detective clubs met in every major city, and ordinary citizens felt entitled to opinions about criminal cases that, a generation earlier, they'd never have known about. Crime had gone from something shameful to something fascinating, and detection had become everyone's business. Victorian detectives faced an interesting problem. They were expected to use scientific methods that hadn't been invented yet. The public, inspired by the Industrial Revolution's miracles, believed science could solve everything. Crime should yield to systematic investigation, just as disease yielded to medicine and ignorance yielded to education. The reality was considerably messier. Let's start with fingerprints, which seems so obvious now. The ancient Chinese knew that fingerprints were unique, but Victorian England had to rediscover this fact slowly and skeptically. In the 1880s, Francis Galton, Darwin's cousin and a polymath obsessed with measurement, began studying fingerprints systematically. He proved they were unique and unchanging, published a classification system, and lobbied for their use in criminal identification. Scotland Yard resisted for years. Why? Because the existing system worked well enough. Police used anthropometric measurement, recording a suspect's height, arm length, foot size, and head dimensions. Alphonse Bertillon in France had developed this system, and British police adopted it enthusiastically. It was scientific, it used numbers, it looked impressive in court. The problem was it didn't actually work very well. Measurements could vary depending on who took them and when. People of similar builds would have similar measurements, and the whole process was time-consuming and undignified. But bureaucracy had invested in the infrastructure, special measuring devices, trained officers, extensive files, so fingerprinting had to wait. Not until 1901 did Scotland Yard officially adopt fingerprinting, making the Victorians technically ahead of the curve by their final year. The first British conviction using fingerprint evidence came in 1902, just after Victoria's reign ended. But the groundwork was laid in those final Victorian decades when stubborn scientists insisted that the tiny whorls on fingertips could revolutionize criminal justice. Photography arrived earlier but was used oddly. By the 1840s, police could photograph arrested suspects, creating rogues galleries that officers would study to memorize criminal faces. These photos were stiff, formal portraits that made everyone look guilty, even the innocent. Crime scene photography started in the 1850s, but wasn't systematic until much later. The main problem was technology. Early photographs required long exposure times. A murder victim could be photographed, but a dynamic crime scene couldn't. Detectives couldn't photograph footprints, they'd blur. Blood spatter, it looked black. Or any scene where lighting was poor. So detectives did what they could. They'd note blood patterns, testify about blood quantities, and sometimes bring blood-stained evidence into court for juries to examine. But the science wasn't there yet. Blood was evocative rather than probative, stirring emotions more than settling questions. Ballistics was similarly primitive. Detectives could sometimes match a bullet to a gun, but only if the gun was unusual or damaged in a distinctive way. Examining bullet markings under microscopes wouldn't become standard until the early 20th century. So shootings were investigated through witnesses, recovered bullets, and the defendant's access to firearms, not through scientific analysis.
Handwriting analysis emerged as a pseudo-science during this period. Experts would testify that they could positively identify handwriting based on unique characteristics. In reality, handwriting identification was unreliable at best and completely fabricated at worst. But juries found it convincing, so prosecutors used it liberally in fraud and forgery cases. The same was true for criminal anthropology, the science of identifying criminals by their physical features. Cesare Lombroso in Italy published influential books claiming criminals could be identified by skull shapes, ear sizes, and facial features. British experts imported these ideas enthusiastically, testifying that defendants looked criminal or had the eyes of a murderer. This was nonsense, of course, but Victorian science was still sorting out which patterns were meaningful and which were coincidence. The same impulse that led to useful fingerprint analysis led to useless criminal anthropology. Both involved careful measurement and classification. The difference was that one measured something real and the other measured prejudice. Detective work relied heavily on interrogation, which was part art, part psychology, and part theater. Victorian detectives would interview suspects for hours, looking for inconsistencies, contradictions, and signs of guilt. They couldn't physically coerce confessions, not legally anyway, but they could use trickery, lies, and psychological pressure. A common technique was the friendly interrogation. The detective would express sympathy for the suspect, suggest the crime was understandable or accidental, and invite the suspect to explain what really happened. Many suspects, worn down by stress and relieved to talk to someone sympathetic, would confess to everything. Later, they'd claim the confession was coerced, but Victorian courts generally sided with police. Detectives also used informants extensively. London's criminal underworld was a community unto itself, with its own rules, hierarchies, and internal disputes. Detectives cultivated relationships with thieves, receivers, and prostitutes who'd provide information in exchange for money, leniency, or protection. This network was invaluable for solving property crimes. Murder investigations were different. Murderers often acted alone, leaving no accomplices to inform on them. They might flee immediately, putting distance between themselves and the crime, and if they stayed, they typically refused to talk, knowing they faced hanging if convicted. So, murder investigations relied more on physical evidence and witness testimony than on informant networks. Autopsies became increasingly sophisticated. Victorian pathologists could determine cause of death with reasonable accuracy, estimate time of death within broad windows, and identify many poisons. They couldn't do DNA analysis, match hair samples reliably, or detect subtle traces of violence. But they could tell a stabbing from a shooting, a drowning from a strangling, and natural death from unnatural. The problem was that autopsies couldn't reveal motive or identity. They'd show how someone died, but not who killed them or why. So pathology informed investigations, but rarely solved them alone. Detectives still needed old-fashioned legwork, interviewing witnesses, checking alibis, and following suspects. Time of death estimation was particularly fraught. Victorian pathologists used body temperature, rigor mortis, and decomposition state to estimate when death occurred. These methods were imprecise. Body temperature varies with environment, rigor mortis follows an unreliable schedule, and decomposition depends on countless factors. Yet pathologists would testify with confidence that death occurred between 10 p.m. and midnight, when honest assessment would be sometime that evening. Toxicology advanced remarkably. Victorian chemists could detect dozens of poisons in bodies, sometimes months after death. They'd testify about dosages, accumulation patterns, and whether poisoning was acute or chronic. This made poisoning cases more prosecutable, but also more complex, as defense attorneys could challenge methodology, chain of custody, and interpretation. The most significant advance was simply in attitude. Early Victorian detectives were often former criminals themselves or came from rough backgrounds. They used rough methods and expected little from science. Late Victorian detectives were increasingly educated, professional, and science-minded. They attended lectures on forensics, read journals, and pushed for better methods and equipment. Scotland Yard established a forensic laboratory in 1888, though it was primitive by modern standards. It had microscopes, chemical testing equipment, and reference collections of fibers, hairs, and botanical specimens. Detectives could submit evidence for analysis, though results might take weeks or months. Still, it was a start, a recognition that science belonged in detection. The public's expectations exceeded reality. Readers of Sherlock Holmes stories believed detectives could reconstruct entire crimes from a few ash particles or identify criminals by their gait. Real detectives couldn't do these things, but they felt pressure to try. Some would present dubious scientific evidence in court rather than admit ignorance. Others would privately roll their eyes at Holmes's impossible deductions while publicly praising the stories. One area where Victorian detection genuinely advanced was record-keeping. Scotland Yard developed extensive criminal registers, catalogues of known criminals with physical descriptions, known associates, and typical methods. Detectives would cross-reference crimes with these registers, looking for patterns. If burglars struck using a particular technique, detectives could narrow suspects to those who'd used that technique before. This was basically early data analytics, done with paper, ink, and memory. It worked surprisingly well for career criminals who had established patterns. It worked poorly for first-time offenders or criminals who varied their methods. But it represented a systematic approach that moved detection beyond pure intuition.
The telegraph revolutionized criminal apprehension. A criminal could commit a crime in London and board a train to Liverpool, thinking they'd escaped. But the telegraph was faster than any train. Liverpool police would receive descriptions and arrest the suspect at the station. This particularly helped with murder investigations, where suspects often fled immediately. One famous case shows how technology and traditional detection combined. In 1910, just after the Victorian era, Dr. Hawley Crippen murdered his wife in London and fled to Canada with his mistress. Police used telegraph to alert Canadian authorities, who arrested Crippen when his ship docked. What made the case remarkable was that police identified Crippen from newspaper photographs, an early use of mass media in detection. Victorian detection was a bridge between gut instinct and modern forensics. Detectives knew science mattered, but hadn't yet developed reliable scientific methods. They knew evidence was crucial, but couldn't always interpret it correctly. They wanted certainty, but had to settle for probability. In this, they were remarkably modern, acknowledging the limits of knowledge while pushing those limits steadily outward. Some Victorian crimes became more than headlines. They became myths, cautionary tales, and national obsessions. Let's walk through the dark gallery of cases that defined the era and still whispered to us across the centuries. The Ratcliffe Highway murders of 1811 technically predate Victorian era, but they set the template for Victorian crime panic. In December 1811, someone murdered the Marr family, husband, wife, baby, and apprentice, in their shop in London's East End. The killer used a maul, a heavy hammer, with such violence that the crime scene was described as slaughterhouse by witnesses. 7 days later, the killer struck again at the King's Arms Tavern, murdering the publican, his wife, and a servant. London erupted in terror. Residents armed themselves, formed vigilante patrols, and suspected everyone. The paranoia was extraordinary. This was supposed to be the modern age, the rational age, yet a madman was butchering families for no apparent reason. Police arrested John Williams, a sailor, based on circumstantial evidence. Before trial, Williams hanged himself in his cell. Authorities, desperate to calm the public, declared the case solved. Williams's body was paraded through the streets before being buried at a crossroads with a stake through his heart, a traditional disposal method for suicides and vampires. Whether Williams was actually guilty remains debated. The case established patterns that would repeat throughout the Victorian era: public panic, pressure on police to solve cases quickly, satisfaction with convenient suspects even when evidence was thin, and the transformation of crimes into entertainment. The murders inspired plays, ballads, and eventually Thomas de Quincey's infamous essay on murder considered as one of the fine arts. Jump forward to 1840 and Lord William Russell's murder. Russell, a wealthy man, was found with his throat cut in his Mayfair townhouse. The murder weapon was nowhere to be found. The house showed no signs of forced entry. Police initially suspected burglary gone wrong, but the evidence didn't support it. Inspector Nicholas Pierce suspected the butler, François Courvoisier. But how to prove it? Courvoisier claimed Russell had dismissed him the previous evening, meaning he had no opportunity. But Pierce discovered Courvoisier had stolen items from Russell over time. A search found stolen goods hidden in Courvoisier's pantry. Confronted with evidence, Courvoisier confessed. He'd killed Russell after being caught stealing, hoping to blame burglars. The case was significant for several reasons. It showed that servants, trusted members of households, could be murderers.
It demonstrated that systematic investigation could solve seemingly impossible crimes, and Courvoisier's public hanging drew a crowd of 40,000 people, including Charles Dickens, who was so disturbed by the spectacle that he advocated for ending public executions. The 1856 murder of Sarah Harriet Thomas was equally sensational. The Mannings were a married couple who invited O'Connor to dinner, shot him, and buried him under their kitchen floor. They then fled with his valuables, heading in different directions to confuse pursuit. But the telegraph caught them. Police telegraphed descriptions to ports and stations. Frederick was arrested in Jersey. Maria was caught in Edinburgh trying to sell O'Connor's railway shares. Their trial was a sensation. A married couple committing murder together seemed particularly shocking. Both Mannings were hanged together at Horsemonger Lane Jail. Again, the crowd was enormous. Dickens attended and wrote about it, criticizing the carnival atmosphere. Maria Manning wore black satin to her execution, and afterward sales of black satin plummeted. Women refused to wear what a murderess had worn. Fashion influenced by execution is perhaps the most Victorian thing imaginable. The 1856 murder of Sarah Harriet Thomas was significant because it remained unsolved, demonstrating the limits of Victorian detection. Thomas was found beaten to death in her bed in Wiltshire. No suspects were ever identified. No motive was established. The case generated widespread media coverage and numerous theories, but the killer was never found. This frustrated the Victorian appetite for resolution. Unsolved murders suggested that chaos couldn't be completely controlled, that evil could act without consequence. It was deeply unsatisfying in a way that even gruesome solved murders weren't. The Victorians wanted their stories to have endings. The 1860 Road Hill house murder already mentioned earlier deserves deeper examination. 4-year-old Frances Sable Kent's body was found in the outdoor privy, throat cut, partially stuffed down the opening. The crime seemed impossible. Who could murder a child in a house full of people without anyone noticing? Inspector Witcher arrived from Scotland Yard and methodically investigated. He noticed the missing nightdress belonging to Constance Kent, Frances's 16-year-old half-sister. He theorized that Constance, jealous of her father's new family, had killed Frances. The accusation scandalized society. Young ladies from respectable families didn't commit murder. The press crucified Witcher.
5 years later, Constance confessed. She'd acted alone, motivated by resentment toward her stepmother and father's favoritism. The confession vindicated Witcher, but came too late to save his career. The case showed how social prejudice blinded people to evidence. It also demonstrated that family murders, parricide, fratricide, infanticide, were more common than Victorians wanted to admit. The poisoning of Charles Bravo in 1876 became one of Victorian England's most debated mysteries. Bravo, a barrister, died in agony from antimony poisoning at his home in Balham. His wife Florence had been having an affair with an elderly doctor. The doctor was ruled out quickly. He'd been nowhere near Balham. Florence claimed innocence. The servants claimed ignorance. 2 inquests failed to establish who poisoned Bravo or even whether it was murder or suicide. Florence's reputation was destroyed by the proceedings, which revealed intimate details of her marriage and affair. She died an alcoholic recluse years later. The case remains officially unsolved, though theories abound. Did Florence poison him? Did a servant? Did he poison himself to frame Florence? Victorian England couldn't decide. Then came Jack the Ripper in 1888, the case that defined Victorian crime anxiety forever. Between August and November, someone murdered and mutilated at least 5 prostitutes in Whitechapel. The murders were savage, throats cut, abdomens opened, organs removed. The killer was never caught, never identified, never stopped. He simply vanished. The Ripper case terrified London like nothing before. Prostitutes were vulnerable, the police seemed helpless, and anyone could be the killer. Hundreds of suspects were investigated. Theories proliferated wildly. Was it a doctor with surgical knowledge, a foreign sailor, a deranged aristocrat, a Jewish immigrant? Everyone had an explanation, none provable.
The case exposed deep fissures in Victorian society. It showed the horrific conditions of East End poverty, women selling their bodies for pennies, sleeping in doss houses, drinking themselves numb. It revealed police inadequacies. They had no forensic capabilities, no way to process crime scenes, no method for catching the killer who struck randomly. And it demonstrated the power of media to create panic and spread false information. Letters supposedly from the Ripper arrived at newspapers and police. Most were hoaxes, but the Dear Boss letter gave the killer his name and created his persona. Taunting, theatrical, surgical. Whether the Ripper wrote any of the letters is unknown, but they became part of his legend, making him seem clever and mocking rather than simply brutal. The murders stopped as mysteriously as they'd started. Did the killer die? Emigrate? Get arrested for something else? No one knew. The case remained officially open. Over the years, theories multiplied into hundreds of suspects, from the Duke of Clarence to Lewis Carroll. The truth is, we'll never know who Jack the Ripper was, and that uncertainty is part of why the case still fascinates. The 1889 Cleveland Street scandal wasn't murder, but shocked Victorian England equally. Police raided a brothel on Cleveland Street where teenage telegraph boys were prostituted to wealthy men. The investigation threatened to expose prominent figures, including possibly members of the royal family. Suddenly, the investigation slowed. Key suspects fled abroad. The case was quietly buried. This exposed hypocrisy at Victorian society's heart. The same people who preached moral purity and family values were revealed as predators or enablers. The press covered the scandal extensively, then dropped it when warned about libel. The message was clear: justice depended on who you were. Poor criminals hanged. Wealthy criminals took holidays in France. The Adelaide Bartlett trial of 1886 for murdering her husband with chloroform remains one of Victorian jurisprudence's oddities. Edwin Bartlett died with liquid chloroform in his stomach, a nearly impossible feat. How could she have administered it without him resisting violently? The prosecution couldn't explain. The defense suggested suicide or accident. Medical experts testified, but couldn't agree on whether murder was even possible using this method. The jury, utterly confused, acquitted Adelaide. Afterward, one expert reportedly said, "Now she's been acquitted, she should tell us how she did it." But Adelaide never explained, and the mystery of how liquid chloroform entered Edwin Bartlett's stomach without violence remains unsolved. The 1890 Brides in the Bath murders technically occurred after Victoria's death, but grew from Victorian patterns. George Joseph Smith bigamously married multiple women, then drowned them in bathtubs to collect insurance money. He'd perfected a method, suddenly pulling their legs upward, causing their heads to go underwater while they were disoriented. They drowned quickly, and it looked like accidents. Smith was caught because one detective noticed a pattern. Several brides dying in baths seemed statistically impossible. Smith was hanged in 1915, but his case showed how Victorian crime patterns extended into the Edwardian era and how serial killers could operate successfully when police had no way to connect crimes across different jurisdictions. The 1890 Peasenhall murder of just after Victoria's reign deserves mention because it shows Victorian investigation methods' final evolution. Rose Harsent, a young servant, was found murdered in her employer's home. She'd been stabbed and had burnt remains of a letter nearby. The letter implicated William Gardner, a local married man with whom she'd been having an affair. 2 trials resulted in hung juries. The evidence was circumstantial. Gardner had motive and opportunity, but no direct evidence linked him to the murder. The case demonstrated that by century's end, English juries required strong evidence for conviction, not just suspicion and circumstance. It also showed that forensic evidence, the burnt letter, the weapon analysis, the blood patterns, was becoming central to trials, even when interpretation remained disputed. These cases share common threads. They revealed Victorian society's dark undersides: domestic violence, child abuse, sexual hypocrisy, class inequality, poverty's desperation. They showed detection's evolution from intuition to science, though science remained primitive.
They demonstrated justice's unevenness, quick for the poor, slow for the rich. And they fed an insatiable public appetite for crime stories that transformed real tragedies into entertainment.
What's striking about Victorian famous crimes is how they became mythologized almost immediately. The Ratcliffe Highway murders happened in 1811, but were being dramatized within months. Jack the Ripper operated in 1888, and by 1890 there were plays, books, and tours of Ripper territory. Victorians didn't just experience crime, they consumed it, processed it, and turned it into stories that explained their world. These stories served purposes beyond entertainment. They reinforced social messages about morality, class, and proper behavior. Servant murderers showed why servants needed supervision. Sexual scandals demonstrated vices' consequences. Poisoning cases warned about women's domestic power. Each crime became a parable about Victorian values, even when the crime itself contradicted those values. The crimes also reflected anxieties about modernity. Railroads let criminals escape quickly, but telegraph caught them. Cities created anonymity for criminals, but also witness crowds. Science promised solutions, but science was still developing. Victorians lived in a world transforming faster than they could understand, and crimes seemed to epitomize that destabilizing change. Finally, these cases showed courage and dedication among detectives who worked with primitive tools. They had no DNA, no security cameras, no cell phone records. They had observation, logic, informants, and persistence. That they solved as many cases as they did speaks to their skill. That they failed to solve others reminds us that reality is messier than detective fiction suggests. Let's talk about what actually happened when someone was caught. The Victorian criminal justice system was elaborate, often unfair, and constantly evolving. From arrest to execution, or release, the system reflected Victorian society's contradictions. Humanitarian impulses battling punitive traditions, reform movements confronting entrenched corruption, and genuine justice occasionally breaking through prejudice and procedure. The Metropolitan Police Force, established in 1829, started with about 3,000 men walking beats in London. By the end of Victoria's reign, the force had grown to over 16,000. These bobbies wore distinctive uniforms, blue coats, tall, reinforced hats, useful for standing on to see over crowds or being used as impromptu seats, and carried wooden truncheons. They were forbidden from carrying firearms except in extraordinary circumstances. Being a Victorian police constable was brutal work. You walked a beat for 8 to 10 hours, in all weather, with only a whistle to summon help if trouble arose. You earned modest pay, about £1 per week initially, and lived under strict discipline. You couldn't vote, couldn't join unions, and could be fired for being drunk, insubordinate, or even just unpopular with superiors. Recruitment was hit or miss. Early police forces attracted former soldiers, laborers, and men with few other options. Many were illiterate. Training was minimal. A few days of instruction, then on to the streets with a more experienced constable. Standards slowly improved, but even late Victorian police included men of questionable character who saw their position as an opportunity for petty tyranny or corruption. Corruption was endemic. Constables supplemented low wages by taking bribes, from street vendors to let them trade, from prostitutes to ignore them, from publicans to overlook after-hours drinking. Some were on the payroll of criminal organizations, tipping them off on raids. Others simply stole from people they arrested. The force tried to control corruption through strict discipline and internal investigations, but eliminating it proved impossible. Arrest procedures were informal by modern standards. If a constable caught someone committing a crime or had strong reason to believe they'd committed one, he could arrest them on the spot. No reading of rights, no immediate access to lawyers. The arrested person would be taken to the local police station, searched, and locked in a cell until they could be brought before a magistrate. Magistrates' courts operated daily, processing a constant stream of minor offenses: drunkenness, vagrancy, petty theft, disturbing the peace. Most defendants were poor, unrepresented by lawyers, and quickly sentenced. A typical session might handle 50 cases in a morning. Justice was swift, but not necessarily accurate. If you couldn't pay a fine, you went to prison. If you had a record, sentences were harsher. If you looked respectable and spoke well, judges were lenient. Serious crimes went to higher courts, the Old Bailey in London, assizes elsewhere. These were formal proceedings with robed judges, barristers in wigs, and juries of property-owning men. Trials could last days or even weeks. The accused could hire defense counsel, though many couldn't afford it. Until 1836, defendants in felony cases couldn't even testify in their own defense, a rule supposedly protecting them from self-incrimination, but actually denying them a voice. Hearsay was increasingly excluded. Judges gained power to exclude unreliable testimony. Expert witnesses became common. But trials retained medieval elements, archaic language, elaborate ceremony, and a presumption that judges knew best. Juries were unpredictable, sometimes ignoring evidence to acquit popular defendants or convict unpopular ones. The death penalty awaited those convicted of murder, and in early Victorian times for many other crimes too. In 1800, over 200 offenses carried capital punishment: theft of property worth more than a shilling, cutting down trees, being in the company of gypsies for a month. This bloody code was gradually reformed. By mid-century, only murder and treason remained capital crimes in practice, though technically the death penalty remained for others. Public hangings, as mentioned earlier, were enormous spectacles. The condemned would be brought from Newgate Prison or other jails in a cart, crowds lining the route. At Tyburn, until 1873, or later outside Newgate, until 1868, they'd be hanged, often giving a final speech. The crowd would cheer or jeer depending on the crime and the prisoner's demeanor. These events were supposed to deter crime by showing its consequences. In reality, they became circuses where pickpockets worked the crowds, vendors sold food and souvenirs, and spectators treated execution days like holidays. Reformers argued that public hangings brutalized society rather than improving it. After 1868, executions moved inside prison walls, attended only by officials and select witnesses. Private hangings were more clinical but no less grim. The condemned would spend their final days in a special cell. On execution morning, the chaplain would pray with them. Then the hangman, often the famous hangman James Barry, would pinion their arms, place a hood over their head, and walk them to the gallows. The trap would drop, and if the hangman calculated drop distance correctly based on the prisoner's weight, death was quick. If not, the condemned might strangle slowly or even be decapitated. Hangmen became quasi-celebrities, writing memoirs and giving interviews about their craft.
Not all convicted murderers hanged. The insanity defense existed, though proving it was difficult. Defendants had to show they couldn't distinguish right from wrong at the time of the crime, the McNaughton Rule, established in 1843. If successful, they'd be sent to Broadmoor Criminal Lunatic Asylum rather than executed. This was arguably worse. Broadmoor patients were confined indefinitely with no prospect of release, living among the violently insane. Prisons evolved dramatically during Victoria's reign. Early Victorian prisons were chaotic places where men, women, and children mixed freely. Prisoners paid for better accommodations, and alcohol was readily available. Reformers were horrified. They believed prisons should reform criminals through discipline, reflection, and religious instruction. The result was the separate system: total isolation. Prisoners spent 23 hours daily in individual cells, seeing only chaplains and guards. When moved, they wore masks so other prisoners couldn't see their faces. The theory was that isolation would force reflection and remorse. The reality was that it drove many prisoners insane. By the 1850s, the separate system was being abandoned as inhumane. It was replaced by the silent system.
Prisoners could work together but were forbidden from speaking. This was only marginally better. Prisons became grim places of hard labor, picking oakum, unraveling old rope, turning cranks connected to nothing, literally pointless labor designed to be punishing. Walking treadmills for hours. The goal was to break prisoners' spirits, making them docile and obedient. Women prisoners faced particular hardships. They were often imprisoned for prostitution, drunkenness, or infanticide, crimes born of poverty and desperation. In prison, they performed laundry and sewing, skills supposedly preparing them for domestic service upon release. In reality, prison records made finding respectable employment nearly impossible. Many released women prisoners returned to the streets that had gotten them imprisoned in the first place. Children could be imprisoned for trivial offenses. An 8-year-old might serve weeks in prison for stealing food. Reformers advocated for separate juvenile institutions, leading to the creation of reformatories and industrial schools in the mid-Victorian period. These were supposed to educate and train young offenders rather than simply punish them. In practice, they were often harsh places where children endured beatings, inadequate food, and emotional abuse under the guise of discipline. Transportation, sending convicts to Australia, was a major part of early Victorian justice. Between 1788 and 1868, about 162,000 convicts were transported, including many Victorians in the first half of the era. Transportation was considered a middle ground between execution and imprisonment, serious enough to deter crime but not as final as death. It also solved Britain's prison overcrowding problem by shipping problems overseas. Transported convicts faced hard labor in Australia, working on infrastructure projects, or assigned to free settlers as laborers. After serving their sentences, they could stay in Australia as free settlers or try to return home, though return passages were expensive. Some transported convicts prospered in Australia, but many died young from hard labor, disease, or accidents. Transportation ended in 1868, partly because Australia no longer wanted Britain's criminals, and partly because reformers saw it as inhumane. Penal servitude replaced transportation, long prison sentences with hard labor. Sentences could be measured in decades. Prisoners would serve years in isolation, then years at hard labor, gradually earning small privileges, a book, letters from family, better food. The system was designed to grind prisoners down, making them grateful for tiny mercies and desperate to earn release. Ticket of leave was the Victorian version of parole. Prisoners who'd served part of their sentence and shown good behavior could be released on license. They had to report regularly to police, live at an approved address, and maintain employment. Violating ticket of leave terms meant immediate return to prison. It was meant to reintegrate prisoners gradually, though in practice, the restrictions and stigma made successful reintegration rare. Prison reform movements gained strength throughout Victoria's reign. Elizabeth Fry, a Quaker, advocated for humane treatment of women prisoners, regular religious instruction, and useful work rather than pointless punishment. Her work influenced policy, though implementation was slow. John Howard's earlier prison reform ideas continued to echo. Prisons should be clean, healthy, and focused on reform rather than pure punishment. By late Victorian times, prisons had improved marginally. Sanitation was better, reducing disease. Violence was more controlled. Some educational programs existed. But prisons remained brutal places where punishment took precedence over rehabilitation. The majority of prisoners were there for poverty-related crimes, theft, vagrancy, failure to pay debts. Prisons essentially punished people for being poor, then released them poorer still, with records that prevented employment. The police-prison pipeline was relentless. Recidivism rates were high. Once someone entered the criminal justice system, escaping it was nearly impossible. Each arrest made future arrests more likely. Each prison sentence made the next one longer. The system claimed to reform criminals, but actually created them, taking people who'd made mistakes and ensuring they had no path except continued crime. Some police were genuinely dedicated to justice. They worked long hours for low pay, protected communities, and risked their lives arresting dangerous criminals. They investigated patiently, treated victims compassionately, and took satisfaction in solving cases. These were the Victorians who transformed police from hated oppressors into respected servants of order. But the system was stacked against justice in fundamental ways. Police were undertrained and underpaid. Courts processed cases too quickly for careful consideration. Prisons punished rather than rehabilitate. And underlying everything was class bias. Poor people received harsh justice, while wealthy people received second chances. A gentleman's son caught stealing might be sent abroad to make his fortune. A laborer's son would go to prison.
The death penalty exemplified this inequality. Analysis of execution records shows that servants who murdered employers were hanged with brutal efficiency, while employers who killed servants often escaped with lesser charges or verdicts of temporary insanity. Women who murdered abusive husbands were hanged, while men who murdered wives they accused of adultery received sympathy and light sentences. Justice wasn't blind. It was very aware of who stood in the dock. Yet change happened. Reformers pushed constantly for improvements. Parliamentary inquiries investigated prison conditions. Newspapers exposed corruption. Slowly, grudgingly, the system became slightly more humane, slightly more fair, slightly more interested in truth than in maintaining order at any cost. By the end of Victoria's reign, British criminal justice was still far from perfect, but better than it had been at the start. The Victorian era established patterns that persist today: professional police forces, systematic investigation, evidence-based prosecution, imprisonment as primary punishment. It also established problems that persist: over-policing of poverty, racial and class bias in sentencing, prison systems that create criminals rather than reducing crime. Understanding Victorian criminal justice means understanding the roots of our own system with all its contradictions and compromises. Now let's descend into the places Victorian respectable society preferred to ignore: the rookeries, the flash houses, the dens where the criminal underworld actually lived and operated. This wasn't the stuff of detective novels. This was survival, desperate and inventive in the shadows of the gaslit streets. Victorian London's rookeries were labyrinths where police rarely ventured. Places like Jacob's Island in Bermondsey, described by Dickens in Oliver Twist, were warrens of collapsed buildings, filthy courts, and passages so narrow two people couldn't pass without turning sideways. Cholera bred here, typhoid flourished. Children played in open sewers, and crime was simply one option among many for staying alive. The criminal classes, a Victorian term suggesting crime was hereditary, lived in these neighborhoods alongside the honest poor. The distinction wasn't always clear. A costermonger might sell fruit, but also fence stolen goods. A woman who took in laundry might occasionally pick pockets. A child apprenticed to a cobbler might burgle houses at night. Crime supplemented legitimate income for thousands who couldn't survive on legal wages alone. Professional criminals had their own hierarchy and customs. At the top were the master criminals, receivers of stolen goods, brothel keepers, forgers, and confidence men who ran operations like businesses. They had capital, connections, and enough cunning to avoid arrest. They dressed respectably, lived in decent houses, and might even be known to local police who tolerated them in exchange for information about competitors. Below them were journeyman criminals, experienced thieves, burglars, pickpockets, and robbers who worked independently or in small gangs. These were skilled trades requiring training and practice. A good pickpocket needed years to develop the light touch and quick hands necessary to lift a watch without the victim noticing.
A burglar needed to know locks, windows, and the layout of houses. A confidence man needed to read people and adapt his story instantly. At the bottom were petty criminals. Children who stole handkerchiefs, desperate people who snatched food, prostitutes who rolled drunk clients for their money, and anyone who committed small crimes for immediate survival. These people faced the most danger of arrest and the harshest punishment relative to their gains. They were the cannon fodder of the criminal world. Criminal gangs operated in every major city. They controlled territories, enforced rules, and ran protection rackets. Publicans paid for protection from vandalism. Street vendors paid to avoid harassment. Even prostitutes paid gangs for protection from violence, although the gangs themselves were often the threat. These weren't organized like modern crime syndicates. They were loose associations based on neighborhood, kinship, and mutual benefit. The rookeries had their own economy entirely separate from legitimate commerce. Stolen goods moved through networks of receivers, each taking a cut, until items emerged cleaned of their criminal origin. A silver watch stolen in Mayfair might pass through 5 hands before being sold openly in a pawn shop miles away. Each transaction was carefully anonymous. No receipts, no records, no evidence. Flash houses were pubs where criminals gathered, made deals, and planned crimes. Police knew about them but couldn't shut them down without evidence of specific crimes. The publican would serve as informal banker, holding stolen goods temporarily or providing loans. Criminals would gather in back rooms to divide spoils, hire accomplices, or settle disputes. These places had their own codes: no discussing crimes in front of outsiders, no betraying fellow criminals to police, and no violence inside the house. Thieves had specializations that sound like professions. Cracksmen specialized in breaking safes. Snakemen were small, agile boys who could slip through tiny windows. Magsmen ran confidence games. Schuffelmen passed counterfeit money. Each specialty had its own techniques, tools, and jargon. This criminal professionalization mirrored legitimate societies' increasing specialization. Training happened through apprenticeship. A master thief would take on young boys, teaching them the trade in exchange for a percentage of their takings. Children as young as 5 would be taught to pick pockets, starting with handkerchiefs and advancing to watches and wallets. It was child labor at its grimmest, exploiting children's small size and the fact that juvenile punishments were lighter than adult ones. Fagin in Oliver Twist wasn't entirely fictional. Real criminals ran schools for young thieves, though perhaps not with Dickens's theatrical flair. These operations were more businesslike: acquire children through kidnapping, purchase from parents, or recruiting runaways, train them, send them out daily, and take most of their earnings. The children got food, shelter, and some protection. The master got profit with minimal risk, since children faced lighter sentences if caught. Women participated in crime differently than men. Prostitution was the most common female crime, though whether it was actually criminal depended on circumstances. Soliciting was illegal, but private arrangement was not. Many prostitutes supplemented income by petty theft, picking pockets while with clients or stealing items from rooms. Some graduated to more serious crimes, particularly poisoning. Arsenic was readily available and easy to disguise.
Female criminals faced particular challenges. Victorian society expected women to be passive, domestic, and morally superior. Female criminals shattered this image, making judges and juries uncomfortable. As a result, women often received harsher treatment for similar crimes. A woman who murdered was seen as more unnatural than a man who did, because she'd violated not just legal codes, but gender expectations. Some women became successful criminals through intelligence and audacity. Mary Young, known as Jenny Diver, ran pickpocket operations in the 18th century, but her type persisted into Victorian times. These women dressed respectably, moved in good society, and stole with impunity because no one suspected them. When caught, their trials became sensations precisely because they'd violated expectations so thoroughly.
Organized begging was another criminal enterprise. Beggars would rent children to make themselves look more pitiable. They'd fake disabilities. There were professional suppliers who'd teach you to fake blindness, manufacture convincing artificial wounds, or contort your body to appear deformed. Some beggars made decent livings while appearing to be starving. The fakery enraged Victorians, who saw it as exploiting charity and making them doubt genuine suffering. Gambling dens operated in rookeries and better neighborhoods alike. Card games, dice games, and betting on fights, races, or basically anything offered places where criminals and respectable men might mingle. The house always won through various cheats: marked cards, loaded dice, confederates who'd signal opponents' hands. Losing players sometimes turned violent, leading to the den's own security: large men paid to break up fights and evict troublemakers. Opium dens existed but weren't as common as Victorian literature suggested. Opium was legally available from chemists and widely used in medications. Smoking opium in dens was practiced mainly by Chinese immigrants and sailors who'd acquired the habit abroad. A few dens in London's Limehouse district catered to curious middle-class adventurers seeking exotic experiences. But opium addiction was more commonly a private affair of working mothers dosing screaming babies with laudanum, or middle-class women taking tonics without realizing they were becoming dependent. The criminal underworld had codes that governed behavior. Informing to police was the worst offense. Peaching could get you killed. Even criminals who'd never commit murder would beat informers savagely as warnings to others. This code made detection harder. Witnesses wouldn't talk even when they'd been victimized, knowing that informing put them at risk. Payment of debts was another code. Criminals borrowed from each other constantly. Failing to repay wasn't tolerated. The receiver who held your stolen goods on credit expected payment when you sold them. The flash housekeeper who'd given you a room expected rent. Breaking these agreements meant ostracism or violence. In a world without legal contracts, reputation was everything. Violence was common, but not random. Criminals used violence to enforce rules, punish violations, and protect territory. But excessive violence attracted police attention, which was bad for business. Most criminal violence occurred within the underworld: disputes over stolen goods, rivalries between gangs, enforcement of codes. Random violence against civilians was relatively rare because it served no purpose except attracting heat. Child criminals faced particular tragedy. Some were born into criminal families and knew no other life. Others were orphans with no alternative. Some had been apprenticed to trades but ran away from abusive masters. Victorian society offered few safety nets. Workhouses were dreaded as worse than death. Honest neighbor paid subsistence wages. Crime offered better returns, and for children with no prospects, it made a kind of desperate sense. Many child criminals didn't survive to adulthood. Disease killed them. Tuberculosis, typhoid, cholera flourished in rookeries. Malnutrition stunted growth and weakened immune systems. Violence claimed others: fights with rival gangs, beatings from police, accidents during burglaries. And for those who survived, prison awaited. Child prisoners were supposed to be reformed, but mostly they graduated to more serious crimes, learning from older inmates. Survival strategies in the criminal underworld were remarkably sophisticated. Criminals developed early warning systems, lookouts, signal systems, and safe houses where they could hide from police. They created informal insurance. If you were arrested, your gang might support your family while you were imprisoned. They maintained connections with corrupt officials who'd warn about impending raids. They also tried to go legitimate when possible. A successful thief might invest in a legitimate business: a pub, a shop, a boarding house. This provided legal income and a front for continuing criminal activities. Many receivers operated legitimate businesses as cover, buying stolen goods through the back door while selling legitimate items through the front. Some criminals managed to retire successfully. After years of crime, they'd accumulated enough money to buy respectability: a business, a house in a better neighborhood, new identities. Their past might be rumored, but not proven. They'd live out their days as respectable citizens, their criminal history known only to themselves, and perhaps a few old associates who'd also gone legitimate. Others couldn't escape. Once branded a criminal, finding honest work was nearly impossible. Employers wouldn't hire anyone with a record, landlords wouldn't rent to them, banks wouldn't serve them. Society had decided they were irredeemable, making redemption impossible. So they continued stealing, getting arrested periodically, serving sentences, and returning to the only community that would accept them. The relationship between criminals and police was complex. They were enemies, certainly, but enemies who understood each other. Police cultivated informants who were active criminals. Criminals paid bribes to police for advance warning of raids. Some police were essentially on criminal payrolls. This corruption was recognized as necessary evil. How else could police gather intelligence without informants? How else could they catch bigger criminals except by tolerating smaller ones? Occasionally, this system broke down spectacularly. The turf fraud scandal of 1877 revealed that senior Scotland Yard detectives were on the payroll of a criminal gang running betting frauds. 3 chief inspectors were convicted and imprisoned, shocking the nation. The scandal led to reforms, but corruption persisted. The incentives were too strong. Criminals had money, police were underpaid, and the system depended on morally compromised relationships.
The Victorian criminal underworld wasn't romantic, despite how literature portrayed it. Dickens' Artful Dodger was charming, but real child pickpockets were malnourished, beaten, and likely to die young. Victorian novels about thieves with hearts of gold ignored that most thieves had hearts concerned mainly with survival, willing to betray anyone for a better chance. Yet within this darkness, humanity persisted. Criminals formed genuine friendships. They fell in love. They helped each other when help was possible. They had standards, however flexible. A pickpocket might refuse to rob poor people, targeting only wealthy marks. A burglar might avoid homes where children slept. These weren't saints, but they weren't devils either. They were people making terrible choices in desperate circumstances that offered few good ones. The distinction between criminal and respectable classes was more porous than Victorians admitted. The shopkeeper's son might become a forger. The servant's daughter might become a prostitute after being dismissed without reference. The apprentice might burglarize his master after being beaten once too often. Movement between worlds occurred constantly, usually downward but occasionally upward. Class shaped criminal justice in profound ways. A gentleman who embezzled faced social disgrace but light prison sentences. A laborer who stole food faced months at hard labor. A wealthy man who murdered might claim temporary insanity successfully. A poor man who murdered would hang. The criminal underworld existed partly because the legal economy offered the poor so little that crime became rational. Victorian reformers recognized this. Charles Booth's survey of London poverty in the 1880s documented how the honest poor lived in conditions barely better than criminals, sometimes worse. Reformers advocated for better wages, improved housing, and social programs that would make crime unnecessary. But progress was slow, opposed by those who believed poverty was moral failure rather than economic condition. By century's end, the criminal underworld remained much as it had been, a shadow society where people without better options survived through theft, vice, and violence. Police were slightly more professional, prisons slightly more humane, and justice slightly more equal. But rookeries still existed, children still stole to eat, and the criminal classes continued reproducing themselves, generation after generation, in the dark places respectable society pretended not to see. Understanding this world means acknowledging uncomfortable truths. Victorian crime wasn't primarily about evil people choosing wrong. It was about desperate people in desperate circumstances making choices that seemed reasonable given their options. It was about a society that created conditions where crime flourished, then punished criminals harshly while ignoring the structures that created them. You've walked with me now through Victorian London's darkest corners. We've seen crime as entertainment and crime as survival. We've met detectives armed with intelligence but primitive science. We've watched justice dispensed unevenly, punishment delivered brutally, and reform arriving slowly. The fog that opened this journey now closes around us again. The gaslights dim, the voices of vendors, criminals, and constables fade into history. You're walking back through time, leaving Victorian London behind, but carrying its lessons forward. What terrified Victorians about crime wasn't just violence, it was disorder they couldn't control. They lived in an age of transformation. Cities exploded in size. Technology advanced faster than anyone could process. Social structures that had endured for centuries crumbled. Crime represented chaos they couldn't control, randomness they couldn't predict, and darkness they couldn't eliminate no matter how many gaslights they installed. Their response was characteristically Victorian, systematic, ambitious, and partially successful. They created professional police, developed detection methods, reformed prisons, and established criminal justice systems that persist today. They made justice slightly more rational, punishment slightly more humane, and investigations slightly more scientific. But they also revealed limitations that still constrain us. They couldn't eliminate poverty that drove crime. They couldn't overcome class bias that corrupted justice. They couldn't acknowledge that crime wasn't individual moral failure, but often rational response to irrational circumstances. Their systems inherited prejudices from earlier eras and passed them forward to us, packaged in professional procedures and scientific language that made injustice look like order. The Victorian legacy in criminal justice is mixed. We inherited their police structures, the beat cop, the detective division, the central headquarters coordinating investigations. We inherited their prison philosophies, punishment as deterrent, isolation as reform tool, release contingent on demonstrated rehabilitation. We inherited their forensic foundations, the idea that physical evidence matters, that systematic investigation beats intuition, that science belongs in courtrooms. But we also inherited their blind spots. We still struggle with class-based justice where wealth buys better outcomes. We still operate prisons that create criminals rather than reducing crime. We still have police forces whose relationship with poor communities echo Victorian constables walking beats in rookeries where they were neither trusted nor welcome. We still consume crime as entertainment while remaining uncomfortable with its implications. The Victorians showed us that crime is a mirror reflecting society's values, anxieties, and contradictions. When they obsessed over Jack the Ripper while ignoring systemic poverty that created Whitechapel's conditions, they revealed what they truly cared about: spectacle over solutions, punishment over prevention, maintaining order over addressing causes. When they packed courtrooms to watch trials but opposed meaningful social reform, they showed that crime fascinated them more than justice. Yet the Victorian era also demonstrated that change is possible when people insist on it. The brutal, bloody code was dismantled through persistent advocacy. Public hangings ended when reformers kept demanding it. Prisons became marginally more humane because activists wouldn't stop exposing conditions. Police became slightly more professional because corruption scandals forced accountability. Progress happened slowly, grudgingly, incompletely, but it happened.
The detectives we've met, from the original 8 at Scotland Yard to the thousands of amateur sleuths in drawing rooms, represented a particularly Victorian innovation. They believed problems could be solved through observation, logic, and systematic inquiry. This faith in rational investigation was sometimes naive, often frustrated by limited tools and corrupt systems, but ultimately productive. They established that criminal investigation requires method, not just authority,
and that solving crimes demands understanding people as much as analyzing evidence. The criminals we've encountered, from desperate child pickpockets to calculating poisoners, complicate simple narratives about good and evil. Victorian crime statistics tell stories about poverty, inequality, lack of opportunity, and social structures that crushed people into making terrible choices. Every hanging at Newgate represented not just one person's crimes, but society's failures. Failures to provide education, employment, safety nets, or alternatives to desperation. The victims of Victorian crime deserve remembering too. The murdered children whose cases became sensations but whose lives were forgotten. The women who survived assaults but faced judgment rather than support. The poor whose property crimes went unsolved because they had no connections or status. The families destroyed not just by criminals, but by a justice system that imprisoned breadwinners for minor offenses, leaving dependents to starve or turn to crime themselves. Victorian England taught us that criminal justice systems reflect the societies that create them. A society that values property over people will punish theft more harshly than abuse. A society that fears disorder will tolerate injustice to maintain control. A society that sees poverty as moral failure will criminalize survival. The Victorians did all this, then wondered why crime persisted despite harsh punishments and aggressive policing. But they also showed glimpses of better possibilities. The detectives who genuinely cared about truth, the reformers who demanded humane treatment of prisoners, the juries who refused to convict despite pressure, the journalists who exposed corruption, the ordinary people who insisted that justice should mean more than efficient punishment. These Victorians pushed their society toward fairness, even when institutions resisted. As you walk away from this Victorian journey, consider what we've preserved and what we've changed. We still have detectives solving crimes through investigation. We still have prisons punishing offenders. We still have courts sorting guilt from innocence. But we also have DNA analysis, civil rights protections, public defenders, and social services. We've improved the Victorian inheritance while remaining bound by it. The dark streets of Victorian England stretch behind you now, gaslit and foggy, populated with constables and criminals, detectives and desperate souls, all trying to survive in a world that was transforming faster than they could comprehend. Their struggles shaped our world. Their innovations became our tools. Their mistakes taught us lessons we're still learning. You're back in your own time now, but Victorian ghosts walk with you. Every crime show you watch echoes Sherlock Holmes. Every police investigation uses methods Victorians pioneered. Every debate about criminal justice reform repeats Victorian arguments. Every time you're simultaneously horrified and fascinated by crime, you're being perfectly Victorian. The case files close. The evidence is catalogued. The stories are told. Victorian England's dark streets have given up their secrets, or at least the ones we could discover with modern hindsight and historical distance. Some mysteries remain unsolved. Jack the Ripper's identity, whether Adelaide Bartlett murdered her husband, how many innocent people were hanged, what crimes went entirely undetected. Victorian London keeps some secrets still. But what we've learned matters. Crime isn't simple. Justice isn't automatic. Investigation requires science and humanity. Punishment alone doesn't reduce crime. Systems can improve, but never perfect themselves. And society's approach to crime reveals its deepest values and most troubling contradictions. Thank you for walking these dark streets with me, for tolerating the fog and the grime, the violence and the injustice, the failures and the occasional triumphs, for understanding that history isn't just dates and famous names, but ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances, making choices that seem obvious in hindsight, but were agonizing in the moment. The Victorian era ended over a century ago, but its shadow falls long across our present. We live in their future, inheriting their innovations and their prejudices, their progress and their unfinished business. Understanding their struggles with crime and justice helps us understand our own. Their mistakes warn us. Their successes inspire us.
Their unresolved tensions remind us that justice is never final, always contested, perpetually requiring work. So, rest now. Let Victorian London fade into memory where it belongs, close enough to inform the present, distant enough to see clearly, significant enough to study, past enough to have moved beyond. You've survived a journey through an era when crime was spectacle, detection was revolution, and justice was negotiation between competing interests and imperfect systems. Tomorrow, you'll wake to your own time, with its own crimes and its own detectives, its own injustice and its own reformers. But tonight, you've been Victorian. You've walked streets where shadows held thieves, where constables walked beats in the dark, where detectives solved cases with notebooks and determination, where criminals survived however they could, and where justice, however imperfect, was sought by those who believed it mattered. The gas lamps extinguish one by one. The city sleeps, or pretends to. Somewhere a final constable completes his rounds. Somewhere a last criminal counts stolen coins. Somewhere a detective closes a case file, satisfied or frustrated. Somewhere a prisoner marks another day survived. And somewhere a family sleeps safely, protected by systems the Victorians built and we've inherited. The dark streets of Victorian England are behind you now, but they taught you to see your own streets differently, to question what you accept, to understand what you inherit, to recognize that crime stories reveal truths about the societies that generate them. Every criminal justice system is a mirror. Victorian England's mirror showed a society grappling with modernity while clinging to tradition, embracing science while maintaining prejudice, seeking order while creating chaos.
Our mirror shows something different, but the reflections share Victorian DNA. We're still grappling, still seeking, still imperfect, still improving slowly when people insist improvements must happen. The Victorian detective would recognize our world, more sophisticated but familiar, better but not finished, progressive but still struggling with ancient tensions between justice and order, mercy and punishment, individual responsibility and social conditions. Sleep well, modern detective. You've earned rest after walking Victorian London's darkest streets and surviving to tell the tale. The case is closed on this investigation into crime and detection in an era that launched the modern approach to both. The evidence is presented, the theories are tested, the verdict is history's to render. And in the morning, when you wake, you'll carry forward what you've learned. That crime is complex, justice is hard, systems can improve, and understanding the past illuminates the present. Victorian England's dark streets have one final lesson. History isn't behind us, it's beneath us, supporting or sabotaging everything we build. Understanding that foundation means building better. Good night. Thank you for listening. And remember, every mystery you encounter, Victorian England encountered first and showed us how to begin solving it. Their methods evolved into ours. Their mistakes taught us caution. Their successes proved what's possible when people insist that truth matters and justice means something beyond maintaining order. The Victorian era is over, but its questions remain. How do we balance security and freedom? How do we deliver justice fairly across class lines? How do we reduce crime without brutalizing criminals? How do we satisfy public demands for punishment while recognizing that rehabilitation serves society better? These questions animated Victorian debates and animate ours. Their answers were incomplete, ours are too. But asking the questions honestly, confronting the contradictions directly, and working toward better even when perfection is impossible, That's the Victorian legacy worth preserving. Rest now. Dream of gaslit streets if you must, but wake to your own time, grateful for what's improved while remaining mindful of what hasn't. The dark streets taught you to see clearly, even in fog. Use that vision well. The story ends. The fog lifts. The modern world returns. But Victorian England remains archived in history books and police procedures, in detective fiction and forensic laboratories, in courtroom practices and prison philosophies. We stand on Victorian foundations for better and worse. Understanding those foundations means building more carefully, more justly, more wisely. This has been your journey through Victorian crime and detection. Thank you for walking the dark streets with me. Until next time, stay curious, question assumptions, and remember that every crime story, whether Victorian or modern, fictional or real, teaches us something about ourselves and the world we've created. The case is closed. The investigation is complete. Victorian England has shared its secrets, and you, dear listener, have been the perfect companion through these dark and dangerous streets. Good night, and may justice, imperfect but improving, continue its slow march forward.